The morning sunlight streamed through the windows, illuminating the protagonist's kitchen in a warm, golden glow. They sipped their coffee, scrolling through emails and bills as part of their usual routine. Most days were quiet and uneventful, with the neighborhood humming in the background. But this morning was different. One envelope in particular caught their eye, bright white, with the HOA logo stamped on the front. Curiosity sparked. They tore it open, expecting another routine notice or a gentle reminder about landscaping or maintenance. Instead, their eyes widened and the coffee mug nearly slipped from their hands. The electric bill inside listed an amount that made them blink twice, $5,000 for a single month. Their jaw practically dropped onto the counter. They read and reread the statement, scanning line after line, trying to make sense of the numbers. There had to be a mistake. $5,000. The protagonist had always paid their bills on time, carefully keeping track of usage and charges. This was not just high, it was astronomical. A soft knock at the door pulled them from their shock. Peeking through the window, they saw one of the neighbors strolling by, holding a small basket of mail. "Everything okay?" the neighbor asked, smiling. The protagonist forced a laugh. Just reading the latest electric bill," they replied, shaking their head in disbelief. "I think the HOA thinks I live in a mansion powered by a nuclear reactor." The neighbor chuckled softly and nodded. "You're not the only one. I heard someone mention it at the mailbox. Crazy numbers." They waved and continued down the street, leaving the protagonist alone with their thoughts and a quickly cooling cup of coffee. Determined to understand what had happened, the protagonist opened their laptop and began reviewing past bills, comparing usage and charges. The numbers made no sense. Nothing had changed, no appliances had been added, no unusual energy-consuming projects were underway. This spike was an anomaly, a glaring error that needed to be addressed. They picked up the phone and dialed the HOA office. The voice on the other end was polite but overly formal. "Hello, HOA office. How may I help you today?" The protagonist explained the situation calmly, outlining the absurd bill and requesting clarification. The response was a mix of polite apologies and vague explanations. "We'll look into it," the staff member said. "There may have been a billing error or a temporary adjustment." Weeks passed. The protagonist remained patient, checking their emails and notes, following up politely with the HOA. But the answers remained slow, inconsistent, and frustratingly unhelpful. Each interaction with the office reinforced their initial suspicion. Something was off, and it needed a clever solution. During this time, the protagonist began noticing small patterns in the neighborhood. Whispers of the mysterious bills floated through conversations at the mailbox, in passing waves on the sidewalk, and during casual chats with neighbors. Everyone seemed equally confused, yet no one acted impulsively. It became clear that the HOA's billing system had made a mistake, but how to resolve it effectively was the question. The protagonist took a deep breath, realizing that frustration alone would not fix anything. Instead, they needed a plan, one that combined patience, careful observation, and a touch of clever strategy. They smiled faintly, already imagining a way to highlight the absurdity of the inflated bill while making sure the situation remained under control. As the sun climbed higher, warming the porch and spilling over the freshly trimmed lawns, the protagonist made a decision. They would not let the HOA's mistake ruin their day. Instead, they would turn it into a small adventure, an opportunity to apply ingenuity and wit to a frustrating situation. The $5,000 mystery would not go unresolved. They would investigate, plan, and when the time was right, act with quiet cleverness that would leave a lasting impression on the neighborhood. By late morning, the protagonist had their plan forming. It involved research, timing, and subtle strategic moves that would catch the HOA's attention without confrontation or unnecessary conflict. The situation had shifted from shocking to intriguing, from frustrating to a challenge to solve creatively. And so, with coffee in hand and a calm determination settling in, the protagonist began the first steps of a clever journey. One that would turn an outrageous bill into a story of quiet triumph, ingenuity, and a touch of neighborhood amusement. The protagonist sat at their desk, the laptop screen glowing with spreadsheets, bills, and graphs. They leaned back, taking a slow sip of coffee, and studied the numbers carefully. Something about the $5,000 electric bill simply didn't add up. Month after month, the bills had been consistent, hovering in the typical range for a suburban home. Suddenly, an astronomical figure appeared, and the explanation from the HOA was vague at best. Determined to understand, the protagonist began a methodical investigation. They pulled up every past bill for the last 3 years, comparing usage, charges, and dates. Notes were made in a neat little notebook, each anomaly highlighted in bright ink. The differences jumped off the page. Usage hadn't spiked. No new appliances, no excessive heater runs, no evidence of overnight parties powering the house like a small factory. This bill was an error, plain and simple. The next step was communication. The protagonist called the HOA office again, speaking with a different staff member this time. "Hello, I noticed my latest bill is over $5,000. Could you please explain the charges?" The polite voice on the other end sounded rehearsed. "Oh, let me check. There may have been a temporary adjustment or an account error," the staff member said, glancing at a screen they clearly didn't fully understand. "We'll review it and get back to you." Days passed, weeks passed. The protagonist sent polite follow-up emails, each one professional, concise, and courteous. Yet the responses remained vague, sometimes delayed, and occasionally contradictory. The HOA seemed determined to let the issue linger without resolution. Meanwhile, the protagonist started noticing subtle neighborhood chatter. At the mailbox, a neighbor whispered, "Did you see those bills? They must have made a mistake." On the sidewalk, another nodded in agreement, clearly aware of the strange spike. It wasn't just their home. The HOA's system had made a glaring error, but it seemed no one dared confront it too directly. This gave the protagonist an idea. Rather than confront the HOA aggressively, they could approach the situation with creativity and humor. If the office refused to acknowledge the mistake or fix it quickly, there was a clever way to get their attention without creating conflict. A little ingenuity could turn the frustrating situation into something more memorable, even entertaining. The protagonist began researching methods to temporarily influence electricity flow without causing harm. They read manuals, online forums, and instructional guides on safely controlling non-essential circuits, ensuring that everything they tried would remain legal, ethical, and safe. The goal was not to punish the HOA, but to demonstrate the absurdity of a $5,000 bill in a calm and clever way. Every detail mattered. They mapped out when the HOA office was busiest, which circuits were non-essential, and how to execute a temporary demonstration of the error that would catch everyone's attention. They even made notes about timing, not too early to cause confusion before staff arrived, not too late to lose impact. Humor began to creep in. The protagonist imagined Karen, the familiar, overly precise HOA figure, walking into the office, confident in her daily routine, only to find lights flickering, computers pausing, and an inexplicable moment of chaos that revealed the billing error without a single raised voice. They smiled, amused at the thought, taking meticulous notes on how the reveal would unfold. Neighbors, now subtly aware of the protagonist's attention to detail, began watching from a distance. Some leaned from windows, others lingered on lawns, all intrigued by the quiet mystery unfolding. The protagonist moved through the steps methodically, ensuring safety, discretion, and effectiveness. This wasn't about confrontation. It was about creativity, patience, and a clever demonstration of fairness. By the end of the week, everything was in place. The investigation was complete, the plan was ready, and the protagonist knew exactly how to proceed. The stage was set for a clever, subtle, and humorous response that would finally draw attention to the billing error and highlight the importance of accuracy and transparency. As the sun dipped low over the street, the protagonist leaned back with a satisfied sigh. The situation that had begun as shocking and frustrating was now a challenge, an opportunity to demonstrate intelligence, patience, and subtle humor. They were ready for the next step, the careful, clever execution that would ensure the $5,000 error was corrected in a memorable and effective way. The protagonist leaned back in their chair, staring at the whiteboard in their home office. Colorful markers had transformed the surface into a web of ideas, diagrams, and calculations. Circuits were mapped, schedules noted, and potential outcomes considered. What had begun as a frustrating bill now felt like a challenge worthy of a clever solution. They sipped their coffee and reviewed the notes once more. Every detail mattered. The time the HOA office opened, which circuits were non-essential, and how to ensure the temporary power interruption would be safe and reversible. Safety was the top priority. No equipment would be harmed, no systems permanently disabled. This was a subtle demonstration, not a stunt. The protagonist imagined the scene. Karen, clipboard in hand, arriving at the office, ready to enforce her usual rules, only to be greeted by an unexpected blackout in non-critical areas. The computers would pause, lights would flicker, and the staff would scramble briefly, but harmlessly. It would be a clever nudge, a silent reminder that the $5,000 bill was both excessive and unjustified. Neighbors had begun noticing small changes. The protagonist worked with quiet diligence, testing circuits during times when the office was unoccupied, making careful notes, and ensuring the plan would be executed flawlessly. From a distance, a few neighbors smiled knowingly. They had observed the protagonist's calm, methodical approach, appreciating the patience and attention to detail required to turn a frustrating situation into something clever and engaging. The protagonist also considered timing. A sudden blackout during peak hours could cause panic. Too late in the day and the demonstration would lose impact. After careful thought, they decided the ideal window was mid-morning, when the office was busy, the staff alert, but before any critical tasks were underway. This timing would maximize awareness while keeping the demonstration harmless. Every step of the plan was rehearsed mentally. They visualized themselves sitting calmly at home, observing the results unfold. They imagined Karen packing back and forth, flipping switches, tapping screens, and muttering to herself, all while the protagonist enjoyed the quiet satisfaction of a plan executed with precision and humor. The scenario brought a small, amused smile to their face. They also prepared a follow-up strategy. The moment the demonstration was complete, they would reach out to the HOA office with a polite explanation and evidence of the billing error. The goal was never to humiliate anyone, only to highlight the absurdity of the $5,000 charge and ensure it was corrected promptly. Every action had to be strategic, controlled, and clever. To ensure safety, the protagonists double-checked their research. They confirmed the non-essential circuits that could be temporarily interrupted without affecting critical systems, cross-referenced with the HOA's schedule, and even tested the procedure quietly after hours. Everything worked perfectly, reinforcing their confidence in the plan. Humor and creativity played a central role. The protagonist imagined neighbors noticing the temporary blackout and whispering jokes or nodding appreciatively at the cleverness involved. The situation was turning from a mundane frustration into a light-hearted spectacle, one that maintained safety, legality, and good humor. By the end of the day, the plan was finalized. The protagonist had a complete step-by-step approach that combined observation, preparation, and clever execution. They felt a quiet sense of satisfaction. The $5,000 error, which had initially sparked shock and disbelief, was now an opportunity to demonstrate ingenuity, patience, and strategic thinking. As the sun dipped behind the rooftops, the protagonist reviewed the plan one final time, sipping the last of their coffee. Tomorrow, the execution would begin. They were ready to transform a frustrating situation into a clever, harmless, and memorable lesson in accuracy, attention, and creativity. The stage was set. The HOA staff had no idea what was coming. The protagonist smiled faintly, feeling the thrill of anticipation and the satisfaction of a well-laid plan. Patience, observation, and ingenuity would soon turn the absurd $5,000 electric bill into a story of quiet triumph and neighborhood amusement. The morning air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of freshly cut grass and the soft hum of suburban life. The protagonists stepped onto their porch, coffee mug in hand, surveying their property and the quiet street beyond. Today was the day to put their plan into action. A subtle, clever demonstration that would highlight the absurd $5,000 electric bill without creating chaos or harm. Inside the HOA office, Karen was already in motion. Clipboard clutched tightly, she moved with her usual precision, confident that she would oversee the neighborhood's daily operations with order and control. Unbeknownst to her, the protagonist had already anticipated every step of her routine. Every circuit, every light, and every non-essential system had been carefully mapped. The protagonist began the setup quietly, making sure all safety checks were complete. They toggled the designated circuits during the early morning hours, ensuring that everything would function perfectly at the planned time. The process required patience and attention to detail. Any mistake could spoil the subtlety of the demonstration. Neighbors, sensing something unusual, peeked from windows or lingered on lawns. Some exchanged knowing glances, intrigued by the protagonist's quiet diligence. Over the past week, whispers had spread about the mysterious $5,000 bill and the homeowner's clever investigation. Now, anticipation hung lightly in the air, almost like a soft current of curiosity threading through the street. Inside the office, Corinne moved through her checklist, blissfully unaware that a small surprise awaited her. She glanced at her watch, adjusted her clipboard, and tapped pens rhythmically on the desk, completely confident that her routine would proceed as planned. The protagonist observed from a distance, sipping coffee with calm amusement, quietly enjoying the tension of anticipation. The timing was critical. Too early and the demonstration would go unnoticed. Too late and it would lose impact. The protagonist had chosen mid-morning when the staff were busiest with routine tasks. They envisioned the moment perfectly, lights flickering, screens pausing, and subtle signs of confusion as Corinne and her colleagues attempted to understand what had just happened. Small details mattered. The protagonist double-checked that essential systems remained untouched, ensuring no critical operations were interrupted. Every cable, every breaker, and every switch had been accounted for. The subtle humor lay not in creating panic, but in delivering a harmless, clever reminder of fairness and accuracy. As the minutes ticked closer, the protagonist's anticipation grew. They imagined Corinne's reaction, the slight tilt of her head, the small frown as she examined the office, and the gentle frustration at the temporary disruption. It was not about embarrassment. It was about observation, awareness, and a playful yet instructive lesson. Neighbors, now fully attentive, began to notice the subtle cues. Lights in the HOA office flickered ever so slightly, computers paused for brief moments, and a faint hum of mild confusion drifted through the air. Quiet smiles appeared on windowsills and porches. The anticipation of witnessing the clever demonstration added a layer of amusement and suspense without needing confrontation or drama. Finally, the moment arrived. The circuits were in place, the timing perfect. The protagonist leaned back, eyes on the office, and waited for the reactions to unfold. Corinne tapped the side of a monitor, adjusted a cable, and looked around. The staff paused, trying to understand the minor disruptions, all while the protagonist remained calm, observing the scene with subtle delight. The setup had worked flawlessly. Every precaution, every calculation, every moment of patient planning had paid off. The stage was set for the quiet, humorous, and entirely clever execution of the plan, a demonstration that would highlight the absurd $5,000 bill and remind the HOA, gently yet unmistakably, of the value of accuracy, patience, and thoughtful observation. As sunlight streamed over the rooftops, the protagonists sipped the last of their coffee, feeling a quiet thrill. Today would be a day of subtle triumph, clever strategy, and neighborhood amusement, all unfolding without confrontation, conflict, or chaos. The plan was ready, the timing perfect, and the stage set for a memorable, light-hearted, and instructive lesson in fairness. The mid-morning sun shone warmly across the quiet street as the protagonists settled on their porch, sipping coffee and keeping a calm, watchful eye on the HOA office across the way. The setup had been flawless, every circuit checked, and every precaution taken. Now it was time for the carefully planned demonstration to unfold. Inside the office, Corinne moved briskly from desk to desk, clipboard in hand, completely unaware that the protagonist's subtle plan was about to engage. She tapped at the keyboard, adjusted the thermostat, and made small notes on her clipboard, confident that her daily routine would proceed without incident. Then quietly and deliberately, the protagonist activated the first part of the plan. A gentle flicker of lights in non-essential areas caught Corinne's attention. She paused, tilting her head slightly. A monitor blinked and momentarily froze. "Huh," she muttered, glancing around the office. The staff exchanged curious looks but quickly assumed it was a temporary glitch. The second stage followed seamlessly. A small cluster of lights in the meeting area dimmed briefly, just long enough to cause a moment of surprise, yet entirely harmless. Corinne's frown deepened, and she tapped her pen against her clipboard, her usual confidence showing the first cracks. She glanced at her colleagues, who shrugged in mild confusion. The office was still functional, but the subtle disruption was enough to draw attention. From the porch, the protagonist leaned back, savoring the quiet humor of the situation. Neighbors who had paused their morning routines whispered quietly behind curtains and fences, chuckling softly as the subtle chaos unfolded. Everyone understood that this was clever, harmless, and perfectly executed, a little spectacle of ingenuity that required observation and patience to fully appreciate. Corinne moved quickly to investigate, walking from desk to desk, checking cords, outlets, and switches. She tapped on the office walls, peered behind monitors, and even opened the breaker box briefly, all the while unaware that the temporary disruption was deliberate and entirely safe. Her meticulous nature now worked against her, highlighting the humor of the carefully orchestrated plan. The protagonist watched with calm satisfaction. Every flicker, every pause, every small moment of puzzlement had occurred exactly as intended. This was not about punishment or embarrassment. It was about sending a clear, clever message regarding the $5,000 bill, using ingenuity rather than confrontation. As the minutes passed, Karen and the staff continued to scramble lightly, trying to restore normalcy. Keyboards clicked, monitors blinked, and notes were exchanged in hurried whispers. The protagonist's subtle demonstration had captured attention, forcing the HOA to notice the issue in a way that polite emails and phone calls had failed to achieve. Outside, neighbors smiled quietly, some shaking their heads in amused appreciation. The scene was a lesson in creativity, patience, and clever problem-solving. No one was harmed, no property was endangered, and yet the message was delivered with precision. The protagonist's careful planning had transformed a frustrating situation into a playful spectacle of ingenuity. Finally, the last stage of the plan engaged. The circuits returned to full function seamlessly, lights restored, and all systems operating perfectly. Karen paused, looking around, realizing the temporary disruptions had ceased. A small sigh escaped her lips. The office was back to normal, but the subtle demonstration had made its point. From the porch, the protagonist allowed a faint, amused smile. The $5,000 billing error had been highlighted in a way that was clever, memorable, and entirely safe. The lesson was clear. Creativity and observation could achieve more than frustration or confrontation ever could. As sunlight continued to warm the street, the protagonist took another slow sip of coffee. Karen and the staff were left reflecting on the brief, harmless chaos, likely pondering the importance of accuracy and attention to detail. The neighbors, meanwhile, quietly admired the protagonist's ingenuity, appreciating the humor and cleverness of the demonstration. By mid-morning, the first stage of resolution had been achieved. Awareness had been raised, humor had been delivered, and the groundwork for correcting the $5,000 error was firmly in place. The protagonist sat back, content, knowing the next steps, polite explanation and correction, would now proceed smoothly. The morning continued its steady rhythm across the quiet suburban street. Birds chirped in the trees, sprinklers hummed softly over the lawns, and a gentle breeze carried the scent of freshly mown grass. Inside the HOA office, however, the atmosphere was anything but calm. Karen sat at her desk, clipboard still clutched, reviewing her notes for the morning. Every so often, she glanced at the flickering lights and briefly paused monitors, still unsettled by the subtle disruptions that had occurred earlier. Her staff, normally composed and methodical, were quietly whispering among themselves. "Did anyone else notice the lights?" one asked, trying to remain calm. "I thought it was just me," another replied, tapping the monitor lightly. Papers shuffled, pens clicked, and small murmurs of confusion drifted through the room. The protagonist's clever plan had done exactly what it was intended to do, draw attention without confrontation. Karen rose from her chair and began inspecting each non-essential system, her meticulous nature in full swing. She flipped switches, checked cables, and muttered softly to herself. The staff followed her lead, moving methodically, trying to trace the origin of the harmless disruptions. Despite their efforts, everything appeared to be functioning perfectly, yet the fleeting moments of disruption had already made their point. Meanwhile, the protagonist observed the scene from the comfort of their porch, coffee in hand, quietly savoring the humor and subtle impact of their actions. The neighbors, too, had noticed the unusual activity inside the HOA office. Some peeked from windows, others lingered on sidewalks, all sharing quiet smiles at the protagonist's clever, harmless approach. No one was embarrassed, no one was harmed, and yet the absurdity of the $5,000 bill was now undeniable. Karen paused in the center of the office, arms crossed, eyes narrowing slightly as she reviewed the events. She realized, perhaps for the first time, that her usual routine and assumptions had limits. The disruption, subtle as it was, had highlighted a flaw, a problem that required attention and reflection. The moment had been delivered with humor, cleverness, and composure, leaving no room for confrontation but plenty of room for acknowledgement. The staff exchanged small glances, each recognizing the unusual precision and timing of the events. "It's almost like someone planned this," one murmured, a mixture of curiosity and amusement in their voice. Karen simply nodded, slowly acknowledging that the morning's disruption was intentional and that the cause was likely more clever than careless. Outside, the neighbors whispered quietly to each other, their smiles reflecting quiet admiration. The subtle spectacle had entertained them, demonstrated clever problem-solving, and reminded everyone that intelligence and patience could achieve more than frustration or repeated complaints. The protagonist's approach was a masterclass in observation, preparation, and execution. By late morning, Karen and the staff had returned the office to full function, systems operating smoothly and perfectly. Yet the impact of the brief, harmless disruption lingered. Everyone had been reminded of the importance of accuracy, transparency, and careful attention to detail. The $5,000 error had been highlighted in a way that words alone could never have achieved. The protagonists, still on the porch, allowed themselves a quiet moment of satisfaction. Their plan had been executed flawlessly, humor intact, and no one embarrassed or harmed. The subtle reactions from the staff and neighbors confirmed that the message had landed. The absurdity of the inflated bill was now clear, and the HOA would be forced to acknowledge it promptly. Later in the day, a polite phone call arrived from the HOA office. The staff had reviewed the billing records and discovered the error. "It seems there was a miscalculation," the voice admitted. "We apologize for the inconvenience and will correct it immediately." The protagonist smiled, acknowledging the polite correction. Their patience, creativity, and clever planning had achieved exactly what they had intended. Neighbors, who had witnessed the calm execution and subtle humor of the plan, continued to share quiet smiles and nods of admiration. The lesson was clear. Careful observation, ingenuity, and composure could resolve even the most frustrating situations, and sometimes a little clever demonstration was more effective than words alone. By evening, life on the street had returned to its normal rhythm. Birds chirped, sprinklers ran, and the sunlight cast long, golden shadows over the well-maintained lawns. Inside the HOA office, Karen and her staff reflected on the morning's events, likely reconsidering the importance of diligence, fairness, and attentiveness. Outside, the protagonists sipped the last of their coffee, feeling the quiet satisfaction of a plan well executed and a problem solved with humor, intelligence, and creativity. By mid-afternoon, the neighborhood had returned to its usual rhythm. Lawns glistened under the sun, sprinklers ran in orderly arcs, and the faint hum of distant lawnmowers carried through the streets. Inside the HOA office, Karen and her staff were quietly regrouping. The temporary disruptions had ended, the lights were steady, and all systems were functioning normally. Yet the morning's events lingered in everyone's minds, a subtle, harmless reminder of the absurd $5,000 electric bill. Karen sat at her desk, clipboard open, eyes scanning the office with a newfound awareness. She tapped pens lightly against her notes, reflecting on the morning. For the first time, she acknowledged that her assumptions and routines were not infallible. A clever solution, executed with patience and observation, had highlighted a simple mistake that weeks of polite emails and inquiries had failed to resolve. Her staff, equally reflective, shared quiet nods. There was a newfound respect for the protagonist's approach, calm, clever, and completely harmless. The demonstration had delivered the point without confrontation, embarrassment, or harm. The lesson was clear. Intelligence, preparation, and subtlety could accomplish more than repeated insistence or rigid adherence to routine. Outside, neighbors quietly observed the aftermath. Some leaned from windows, others lingered on their porches, each noting the protagonist's calm demeanor and the way the morning had unfolded. Conversations were lighthearted, often tinged with amusement. "Did you see the lights flicker?" one whispered to another. "I think they planned it," another replied, smiling knowingly. The street had witnessed not chaos, but clever problem-solving. The protagonist, seated on the porch with a steaming cup of coffee, allowed themselves a moment of satisfaction. The plan had worked perfectly, from the careful investigation to the subtle demonstration, and now to the resolution. There was no need for triumphal announcements or dramatic gestures. The quiet acknowledgement from the HOA and the smiles of neighbors were reward enough. A polite email arrived shortly thereafter from the HOA office. The staff had reviewed the records thoroughly and discovered the error. "We apologize for the oversight," the email read. "The charges have been corrected and your account updated accordingly." The protagonist smiled, appreciating the courteous tone. Weeks of frustration had been transformed into a moment of clever triumph, achieved without conflict. Karen, for her part, had begun to adjust her approach to oversight and communication. The morning's events had reminded her that patience, observation, and flexibility were as important as rules and routines. She quietly reflected on the importance of fairness, clarity, and awareness in her role, recognizing that small adjustments could prevent larger misunderstandings in the future. Neighbors continued to share quiet admiration for the protagonist's ingenuity. Some commented on the clever timing, others on the harmless humor, and many on the composure displayed throughout the week. The $5,000 error, once a source of shock and frustration, had become a story of clever problem-solving and calm resolution. By late afternoon, the protagonist moved through routine chores around the property, adjusting flower beds, tidying the walkway, and checking the mailbox. Each task reinforced the sense of independence and calm satisfaction that had defined the week. The neighborhood hummed along quietly, its rhythm restored, punctuated only by small smiles and whispered acknowledgement of the clever morning spectacle. As evening approached, the sun cast golden light across the rooftops, and the streets took on a serene glow. The protagonist sat on the porch one final time, watching shadows lengthen and leaves rustle in the gentle breeze. The $5,000 electric bill was corrected. The HOA had learned a subtle lesson in attentiveness, and neighbors had been entertained by a display of ingenuity executed perfectly and safely. In the calm of the late day, the protagonist reflected on the lessons of the week. Patience, creativity, and subtle humor were far more effective than frustration or confrontation. They had turned a stressful situation into a clever demonstration, leaving everyone involved with a small smile and a lasting impression. The quiet satisfaction of the moment was complete, a reward for intelligence, preparation, and clever execution. The neighborhood, once again peaceful, had absorbed the lesson without drama. Life continued, as it always did, but with a subtle understanding that cleverness, patience, and humor could turn even the most frustrating situations into opportunities for lighthearted triumph and reflection. The evening sun cast long, golden shadows across the neighborhood, bathing neatly trimmed lawns and quiet streets in a warm glow. The protagonist sat on the porch, a steaming cup of coffee in hand, enjoying the peaceful hum of suburban life. The $5,000 electric bill, once a source of shock and frustration, had been corrected, and the clever demonstration earlier in the day had left a lasting impression. For the first time in weeks, the protagonist felt a calm satisfaction that was entirely deserved. Inside the HOA office, Karen and her staff were quietly regrouping. Karen, clipboard in hand, leaned back in her chair, reflecting on the morning's events. She had spent hours checking circuits, reviewing systems, and attempting to trace the brief disruptions. At first, she had been frustrated and confused, but as the day unfolded and the billing error was acknowledged, she realized the subtlety and cleverness of the approach. There was no confrontation, no embarrassment, only a quiet, clever message that had effectively highlighted the issue. The staff shared small nods of agreement, impressed by the ingenuity of the demonstration. They had witnessed firsthand how preparation, observation, and timing could convey a message far more effectively than repeated complaints or emails. The lesson was subtle yet unmistakable. Attention to detail, transparency, and careful planning were critical for smooth operations. And sometimes, humor and creativity could make that point even more memorable. Meanwhile, the neighbors continued to watch quietly, some peeking from windows, others enjoying their evening routines on porches and driveways. They exchanged smiles and whispered observations, clearly impressed by the protagonist's clever handling of the situation. The entire neighborhood, without any disruption to normal life, had witnessed a demonstration of ingenuity and calm problem-solving, leaving them both entertained and quietly inspired. The protagonist, savoring the moment, reflected on the series of events that had unfolded over the past week. It had begun with the shocking $5,000 electric bill, followed by careful investigation, patient communication, and ultimately, a creative, harmless demonstration. Each step had required observation, planning, and restraint. The outcome was not only the correction of the billing error, but also a memorable reminder of how cleverness and composure could turn frustration into satisfaction. Karen, now calmly reviewing corrected records, allowed herself a small, reflective smile. She recognized that her assumptions had been challenged, and that patience, careful consideration, and observation were just as important as rules and procedures. The brief disruption had provided insight, prompting a reconsideration of practices and fostering a subtle awareness of fairness, accuracy, and attention to detail. Outside, the neighborhood's quiet rhythm continued. Children's laughter echoed from nearby yards, sprinklers ran in measured arcs, and the faint hum of conversation drifted along the sidewalks. The protagonist observed the scene with quiet contentment, realizing that the clever, subtle resolution had strengthened not only their own sense of autonomy, but also a shared appreciation of intelligence, patience, and humor among neighbors. The $5,000 electric bill, once a symbol of absurdity and frustration, had become a story of clever strategy and calm execution. The HOA's response, tempered by acknowledgement and correction, reinforced the value of accuracy, communication, and thoughtful oversight. Meanwhile, the protagonist had demonstrated that ingenuity, careful planning, and subtle humor could achieve results far more satisfying than confrontation or conflict ever could. As twilight deepened and the first stars began to appear, the protagonist took a final sip of coffee and watched the neighborhood settle into evening calm. Lights glowed softly in homes, sprinklers clicked off one by one, and the gentle hum of suburban life carried a sense of order and quiet satisfaction. The demonstration had been harmless, clever, and perfectly executed. The neighbors had learned, the HOA had acknowledged the error, and the protagonist had achieved a quiet but undeniable victory. With a contented sigh, the protagonist leaned back in the porch chair, appreciating the harmony of the moment. The street was peaceful, the HOA staff thoughtful, and the neighbors quietly entertained. The absurd $5,000 bill had been transformed into a clever story of strategy, patience, and humor, an experience that would be remembered, quietly admired, and perhaps retold with a smile for years to come. The lesson lingered subtly in the air. Patience, intelligence, and a clever approach could turn even the most frustrating challenges into opportunities for calm triumph, amusement, and respect. The protagonist, satisfied with the day's events, finally set down the empty coffee mug, feeling the full reward of strategy, humor, and a problem well solved.